Well, good morning and thank you for joining us. I'm Amanda Fay in for Jerry Anderson this morning. Well, the midterm elections are now behind us, but results are still coming in for some races that could impact the makeup of Congress for the next 2 years. My first guest this morning, Dr. Sam Nelson, Associate Professor of Political Science for the University of Toledo. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. You were with us on election night. We know a little bit more now, not a whole lot. Things are still kind of a toss-up situation. We don't exactly know where the Senate's going or the House, but kind of get us up to speed here.
So I think that, yeah, some results are going to take another week or two to come in. The runoff in the Senate race in Georgia isn't until next month, 3-4 weeks from now. So final control is up for grabs. If, as it looks like now, Republicans have control in the House, it's going to be narrow, very difficult for them to manage, and Democrats still have a very good chance of keeping control of the Senate.
Okay, because right now we're looking, it's neck and neck. And as you mentioned, that race in Georgia is coming down to a runoff once again.
Right. And that's going to be really interesting. It's going to depend a lot on what happens with the Arizona and Nevada Senate races. That'll change the dynamic. If former President Trump declares that he's a candidate for 24, that's going to change the dynamic down in Georgia. He's a big backer of Herschel Walker, the candidate down there. So there's a lot to watch down there, a lot of money already flowing down there. All of these volunteers and staffers from campaigns that just ended, flooding into Georgia on both sides to work on that campaign.
So a lot of focus will be right there on Georgia, as we have seen in the past. Speaking of former President Trump, we could expect some sort of announcement here in the coming days. Not quite sure yet, but he got out and started supporting a number of candidates here ahead of the midterms. One of them here in our neck of the woods, J.D. Vance, who did win, but did he win by a large majority here, or what are we looking at with some of those candidates that he supported? So
it was a pretty bad night for Donald Trump, and that's the narrative I think that's coming out. Both Democrats and Republicans are pointing to that, as well as journalists and others. J.D. Vance is really the only prominent big ticket candidate that he backed that won. And then let's look at how J.D. Vance won. He won by 6 points when Governor DeWine won by over 20. Statewide races for Republicans in Ohio, they were winning by like 60-40 was the typical number for the auditor, the attorney general, and so on. And then Vance was back at 53, underperforming. Now, part of that is a testament to Tim Ryan running a really strong campaign, being a special kind of candidate. But some of that is the association with Trump. And then we see Herschel Walker in Georgia in a runoff. You know, maybe a different Republican without that attachment to Trump would have already won that race and not needed a runoff. If you look at different House candidates in toss-up races where Trump endorsed somebody, there were 5 of the main toss-up races, all 5 of those lost. So right now, Republicans are thinking, how do we get away from this? He's pulling us down. J.D. Vance, he still wins, he's still a senator. The margin doesn't matter that much to him, but it certainly matters to observers trying to figure out what's the Trump effect on our electoral prospects.
Sure, sure. And when we look at the congressional race here, Marcy Kaptur and Jared Majewski, he obviously lost, but we're talking about in a new district that had just been redrawn that was actually supposed to be more conservative leading. What do you make of that?
Right. I mean, to be honest, that Kaptur won by more than I thought she would. I thought she might lose that race because nobody knew, right? It was a new district and there was no polling. But that was a pretty big margin. She ended up winning by a healthy amount. And I think Majewski was clearly identified with Trump. That really helped him in some of those new parts of the district where Trump is very popular. But, you know, turnout in Toledo and in Lucas County more generally probably really helped her and may have been part an anti-Trump vote as much as it was a pro-Marcy Kaptur vote.
Ah, okay, interesting. And let's talk a little bit about some of the issues, too, that voters had before them. In Michigan, Proposal 3 passed, and that was regarding abortion rights and securing that in the state's constitution. And when we look at Ohio, not exactly an issue there, but as we see the voters really went kind of a right to life direction there. So do you think that issues really brought people out for this midterm?
I do think that, I think abortion was a big issue in a lot of states. And you're right, in Ohio, it doesn't seem that Nan Whaley tried to make it a big issue and it didn't really land. But it wasn't directly on the ballot like it was in Michigan, where you were going to vote yes or no. and some other states, even in Kentucky, it was directly on the ballot. So I think that was important. It was important in driving youth turnout, I think, where there's a lot of attention on that, driving women voters who hadn't voted maybe in the past. Some new voters came in. Obviously, inflation was another issue that people cared about, and that one cut against Democrats and against President Biden. Democracy, though, was a big issue. Joe Biden, gave a couple of speeches in the last month elevating democracy as an issue in this election. A lot of commentators were like, oh, voters don't care about that. They only care about the price of gas. But it looks like they did care about democracy when we look at election deniers in a number of races around the country lost. I think that more people were voting on that issue than maybe was expected ahead of time.
Any big surprises for you?
Well, definitely the small margins for Republicans,
Sure.
right? I mean,
It's supposed to be this big red wave, right?
right. I mean, if you look at President Obama, his first midterm lost over 50 seats. President Clinton in '94 lost, 64 seats, something like that. Wipeouts, just wipeouts. There were 31 House Democrats who retired or didn't run for re-election. That's usually a sign that your party expects, well, we're going to get killed, in this one, right? So I'm not going to run. And that's not what happened, right? Even if Republicans take control of the House, as it looks likely, it's a small margin. It's way underperforming. I mean, the average midterm result is the president's party loses 26 seats. This, Republicans aren't picking up anything like that number.
Do you think maybe, if you looked at any exit polling on younger voters, you mentioned them a little bit, did they have anything to do maybe with a way did they come out?
Younger voters turned out and they voted very strongly for Democratic candidates. It was something like 28 points in favor of Democrats over Republicans, voters under 30. So first Gen Z member of Congress was elected, Max Frost in Florida. And I think issues like student loan forgiveness, which is a bit controversial policy of the Biden administration, but I'm thinking it's less controversial with young people with large student loan debt. Abortion rights really going to be important to younger voters who are, in the prime of might get pregnant.
Sure.
And so on. So I might not be a strong attachment to the Democratic Party as a party. They might not be enthusiastic about some Democratic officials, but they turned out and they voted strongly for Democrats, whereas older voters were voting more strongly for Republicans.
Okay, well, some interesting things to chew on here in the days after the election, and then we're going to be looking ahead to, when this does finally settle and we do finally know who is in charge where, we're going to be looking ahead to where they're going to go next. So stay with us. Coming up here in just a couple minutes, we're going to take a look at what we might be looking at as far as leadership and what Congress may have on the docket here soon ahead. Stay with us. Welcome back, Dr. Sam Nelson, Associate Professor of Political Science for the University of Toledo, joining me again here this morning. Dr. Nelson, we were just talking about the makeup of Congress as we wait for these results to come in, and it's looking likely, we're going to have this runoff, so we're not going to know here for quite some time, at least in Georgia, with that Senate race. It is looking like Republicans will gain control of the House, but really by a slim margin. And right now, Congressman Kevin McCarthy has the minority leader position, but is he a shoo-in to become Speaker of the House?
I don't think he's a shoo-in, but they're going to make him pay for it.
Okay.
His own caucus. I think that there's going to be a lot of maneuvering. And I don't see anybody else who can put together the 218 votes and so on and become Speaker other than him. But I think there are a lot of reluctant supporters of Kevin McCarthy. That's going to put him in a very weak position, make it very difficult for him to manage that caucus.
Yeah, speaking of that, I mean, because of that slim majority there, are we looking at getting anything accomplished here in the couple of years ahead?
I think it's going to be very difficult in terms of legislatively. I think that Republicans are going to be reluctant to give Joe Biden any bipartisan policy victories, right, to run on in 24 if he's the candidate. But there are some things where there are broad areas of agreement. If you look in the last 2 years, the infrastructure bill, there were a lot of Republicans in the House that wanted that infrastructure bill. The CHIPS Act, right, brought a bunch of money into Ohio, right, for those new Intel plants. Those are things that are popular with at least some Republicans and a lot of Democrats. And so there are possibilities, but it's very difficult politically when you don't want, the other side to win.
Right, and so you might just be dragging your feet a little bit or making things a little more difficult than they need to be, right?
Trying to extract some concessions, some deal making. Well,
yes.
How about
Work
you give
projects.
us this tax cut that we want, or make some changes to Affordable Care Act subsidies, or something else that we want. There's also the possibility of a big crisis coming with the debt ceiling. Sometime this spring, we're going to hit the debt ceiling. It needs to be raised. And Joe Biden's going to need Republican votes to get that done. And Kevin McCarthy a few weeks ago was kind of promising to make that a very difficult situation for the president. Now with his majority, if he has it, not being very large, he may not be able to play hardball in quite the way he had hoped to.
Gotcha. Okay, well, any guesses on what some of the issues they could be tackling first?
Well, I mean, we talked during the campaign a lot about inflation and crime. If Republicans have some proposals there to try to address those problems, I think that there'd be meaningful discussions to have around that. Things will come up that we don't know about yet. At some point, probably the president will ask for more funding for Ukraine. Okay. And so I would expect to see, a big debate about that. I think that we're still looking at talking about dealing with some of the things like student loan forgiveness that's now in the courts and coming back to Congress. And then, of course, there's a whole lot of things surrounding things like investigations and oversight and
to the
things
families.
like that. Yeah.
Okay, so it's going to be interesting for sure, and something we're going to be obviously keeping a close eye on as these races continue to come in over the next week. And then, of course, we'll be all eyes on Georgia here for that runoff coming up. Dr. Nelson, thank you so much for joining us this morning, bringing your expertise. We appreciate it. We have more Leading Edge when we come back. Stay with us. Welcome back. Turning our attention now to health. November is Diabetes Awareness Month, and joining me now are Rita Sowinski. She's in Mercy Health's Education Services Program. Also, Kelly Layton. She's a clinical dietitian in the Pediatric Endocrinology Department at Nationwide Children's Hospital Toledo. Ladies, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being here. So, first of all, talk us through the types of diabetes. From what I understand, there's actually more than just types 1 and 2.
So diabetes itself is a long-term chronic disease characterized by difficulty with properly turning food we eat into energy, okay? So what typically happens when we eat, specifically when we eat foods with carbohydrates, these get digested and broken down into sugars. These sugars move into our bloodstream, and then our body makes a hormone called insulin that helps to move the sugar in our bloodstream into our cells, which is where it's used for energy. Okay. Insulin is like a key that unlocks the cells so the sugar can move in.
What a good way to describe it. It's a key. It unlocks it all. Okay. And then in some cases, though, however, the insulin is maybe not doing its job, or, you know.
Yeah, so the different types of diabetes, there's type 1, type 2, gestational diabetes, and pre-diabetes. So there's basically those 4 types of diabetes. And I'll talk a little bit about the type 2 diabetes. Definitely a problem with the insulin. The insulin can't get into the cells very well. And so we have something developing called insulin resistance. It's also happening in the areas of pre-diabetes. So pre-diabetes to type 2 diabetes are kind of a continuum. And some patients with type 2 diabetes also get to the point where they don't make enough insulin. So that's kind of the scope for the pre-diabetes to type 2 diabetes. But type 1 diabetes is different.
And you probably know a little bit more about that working with kids. Is this generally getting these diagnoses as children, or when does that usually happen?
So type 1 diabetes, they used to call juvenile diabetes because we primarily see it in children. That's usually when it first appears, but it can actually happen anywhere in the life stage. So you can be diagnosed with type 1 diabetes as an adult as well, but more typically it appears in children. And type 1 is what we call insulin dependent diabetes, meaning the body cannot make any insulin. So the only treatment for type 1 is you have to take insulin, either by injections, or some people wear something called a diabetes pump. And type 1 diabetes is what we call an autoimmune disease. Our immune system is normally responsible for fighting off things that don't belong, like viruses and bacteria. Sometimes it gets confused though. Something in the environment just kind of flips a switch and it ends up attacking things that do belong instead. With type 1 diabetes, this includes the cells in our pancreas that make insulin. So autoimmune, our cells that make insulin are attacked. These are destroyed. They can no longer make insulin, and that's type 1 diabetes. And it's important to note with type 1, it's not preventable. There's nothing, it's not your fault if you get it, if your child gets it. It's just something that happens, and we treat that with insulin.
Okay, type 2 diabetes, so however, we're talking about 37 million Americans have diabetes, and I'm reading that about 90 to 95% have type 2 diabetes. So, you know, what are the risk factors then? Because this is something, as you mentioned, unlike type 1, which isn't preventable, type 2 can be, correct?
Correct. So, yeah, with type 2 diabetes, we can look at both some genetic factors that maybe aren't preventable, but we can also look at lifestyle factors that we can make some changes and help to prevent the development of type 2 diabetes. So in general, the risk factors go to age, usually over the age of 45. Some ethnic backgrounds are higher risk for developing type 2 diabetes, including African American, Hispanic, American Indian, Latino, as well as Pacific Islanders and Asian. Descents are all at higher risk, so it's quite a big swath of people that have those genetic components that cannot be controlled. But also, what we can control is more physical activity. So people who don't have enough physical activity are at higher risk for type 2 diabetes. Unhealthy eating patterns and putting some weight on are also risk factors for the development of type 2 diabetes.
So someone may find out that maybe they're pre-diabetic or maybe they have diabetes. You have some programs at Mercy Health that can help folks through this. So talk a little bit about what you all have to offer.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so the Mercy Diabetes Education Program is tailored to help patients, mostly adults, or Kelly's program helps more with the kids and the type 1 diabetes. But with type 2 diabetes and pre-diabetes and gestational diabetes are the focuses, are the diagnoses that we work with at the Mercy Diabetes Education Program. So, yeah.
You are able to can you talk one-on-one with them, you know, set up a plan, and, you know, how do you go about doing that?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so we work with patients, definitely. We get referrals from their primary care providers, so we are a referral-based service. Patients can self-refer if they know they have the diabetes diagnosis and want additional support also, but we do need a coordinating physician to work with. Our department is multidisciplinary, so I'm a registered nurse, and we also have a certified dietitian in our program. So we work together interdisciplinary to support patients living with diabetes around their self-care needs. So that's encompassing meeting with them one-on-one and setting some goals and helping them understand their disease process better, and then follow up, because we know diabetes is a lifelong disease and it does change over time. And patients need different supports at different times of their lives. But initial education is really, really important when someone's initially diagnosed with diabetes or pre-diabetes. They can make some changes with lifestyles that can really make a long-term impact on their health and prevention of complications. So especially with type 2 diabetes, we also look at the whole person and what other risk factors they may have around hypertension or high cholesterol that can also cause them to have increasing risk and potentially a lot more suffering if diabetes is not controlled well.
So you brought some props, some items here that we're looking at this morning. First of all, tell me what this is.
So this is an A1C model.
Okay.
So people with diabetes, the way we measure the blood sugar over a 3-month period for control of diabetes and diagnosing diabetes is a lab test called A1C. And so the model there has some big red balls floating in it, and that is the red blood cell.
Okay.
And if you flip it the other way real slow, it's kind of like,
there
it goes. Okay, so the little white balls are glucose.
Okay.
And they're just showing that they bump into that red blood cell. And we measured then how much sugar got coated on that red blood cell over that 3-month period. And through some fancy math, we get these percentages. And from those percentages, the doctors make these nice criteria for diagnosing diabetes.
Very good. Okay, and it's all right here.
Right there.
It's all right there. And then obviously we're talking about the technology that is available to you, and things have come a long way, haven't they?
Yes, it's very interesting. So a lot of this technology has been developed and has helped, especially with kids, just reduce the burden of caring for diabetes, because there are a lot of things people have to do every day. Traditionally, people have had to poke their finger to check their blood sugar 4 to 6 times per day. Kids with type 1 diabetes have to do multiple injections per day, typically 4 to 6 times per day. And that's every day.
Yeah,
so a
that's
lot of
tough.
this technology just reduces the burden for them, makes things a lot easier, helps their caretakers kind of keep track of them. So just a couple things we have here. Continuous glucose monitors. You may have seen advertisements for these on TV. 2 brands we have are the Freestyle Libre and the Dexcom. These are both sensors that stick on the skin, just like a sticker.
There we go.
Yeah, and you keep it on for 10 to 14 days. It can send all your blood sugars to your phone. Your loved ones can follow you and see your blood sugars. We also have diabetes pumps. These are 2 common pump brands on the market right now, and these are something that a person would wear to deliver insulin continuously.
Right into the system, right?
Yep, so then they don't have to be taking shots, they don't have to be poking their finger all the time. This can be more discreet for some people. It's easier to monitor. Some of these systems also talk to each other as well. So the glucose monitors and pumps can talk to each other to kind of help even do things in the background automatically.
Wonderful.
So,
ladies, I really appreciate you joining me this morning to talk about advances and, to just bring up some of this awareness. So thank you so much for being with us. We'll be back right after this. Stay with us. Thank you so much for joining us this morning on Leading Edge, and thank you to all my guests. Have a good day, everybody.